The fluorescent light above his head hummed like a dying insect. For Marcus Hill, that sound was the only proof he hadn't gone completely insane. At Pelican Bay State Prison, silence wasn't peace, it was punishment. He'd been locked in the Security Housing Unit, or SHU, for 1,041 days. A concrete box the size of a walk-in closet, with no window, no sunlight, and no voice except his own echo. The guards called it administrative segregation. The inmates called it the hole. Marcus called it the void. If stories like this fascinate you, hit subscribe, because this one only gets darker. Pelican Bay was never built for redemption. It was designed for control. The walls were soundproof, the corridors sterile, the doors steel. Even the air smelled regulated, recycled through vents that whispered like ghosts. Every inmate here was a problem the system couldn't solve, so it buried them alive behind reinforced glass. Marcus wasn't the kind of man who broke easily. Before prison, he'd worked construction in Los Angeles, a quiet father who made bad choices when the rent came due. But inside Pelican Bay, strength didn't matter. Days bled into nights until time itself felt like another inmate, watching, waiting, mocking him. He started talking to the drain in the floor. First as a joke. Then as a habit. Then as the only conversation he had left. The drain became his confessional, his last connection to a world that might still be listening. Across the corridor, someone screamed for hours, a raw, animal sound that shredded the air. The next day, that voice was gone. No one asked where he went. No one ever asked. Marcus began scratching marks on the wall with the edge of a spoon, a ritual to prove each day existed. But on the 417th mark, he realized something terrifying. He couldn't remember why he was counting anymore. In Pelican Bay, the walls didn't just hold you, they spoke to you. Sometimes in whispers, sometimes in silence so loud it swallowed thought. The psychologists called it sensory deprivation. The inmates called it the mental war. One night, during count, Marcus heard tapping from the other side of his wall. 2 short knocks, then 1 long. A code. Someone was alive in the next cell. The message was clear, deliberate, and familiar. He froze. No one in that block was supposed to communicate, no one could. Yet the rhythm kept repeating, like a heartbeat trying to remind him he wasn't alone. That night, Marcus didn't sleep. He sat against the wall, listening, waiting for the taps to return. When they did, he replied. 2 short. 1 long. A bond formed through concrete. Then, just as quickly, it stopped. The next morning, a guard slid a note under his door. No words. Just a small scrap of paper, damp and creased, with 3 indentations pressed deep into its surface, 2 short, 1 long. Marcus felt his chest tighten. Whoever had reached out to him wasn't just another inmate. They knew him. Outside, the corridors echoed with the sound of boots and the clang of doors. But inside his cell, a new sound had taken over, the beating of his heart, steady, defiant, and afraid. Because in Pelican Bay, contact meant danger. And if someone was trying to reach him, it could only mean one thing: something was coming. When the lights flicked on at 4 a.m., Marcus already knew sleep wasn't coming back. The air was cold enough to sting his skin, and the smell of bleach still clung to his walls, a sign that someone nearby hadn't made it through the night. He stared at the folded scrap of paper again, the one with those strange indentations. 2 short. 1 long. The rhythm pulsed in his mind like Morse code from another world. He'd heard it once before, years earlier, in a holding cell in Los Angeles County Jail. Back then, it was the way inmates communicated when the guards cut power to their intercoms. The code meant, "Are you alive?" Marcus thought about answering again, but the risk was too great. At Pelican Bay, communication between cells was a disciplinary offense. Even a whisper could land you in deeper isolation, or worse, in the psychiatric unit, where no one ever came back the same. Still, that night, he tapped back. 2 short, 1 long. Hours later, a faint reply came, one long, one short, then silence. He didn't know the code, but he knew fear when he heard it. Pelican Bay's security housing unit had its own ecosystem, a quiet, invisible jungle made of whispers, glances, and paranoia. The guards rotated on shifts designed to keep inmates disoriented. Food trays were slid through doors at random times. Even the light cycles were inconsistent. It wasn't neglect, it was design. The system wasn't trying to punish. It was trying to erase. The only constant was the sound of the keys. The metallic rattle down the corridor meant power. Every inmate froze when it came near. Marcus learned to read footsteps like language. He could tell who was coming by the rhythm of their boots. There was Officer Laird, the one who hummed country songs as he checked the doors. There was Officer Valdez, silent, methodical, the one the inmates feared most. And then there was the new one, a young recruit they called the Listener. He had a way of lingering by each cell door, just long enough to hear breathing, scribbles, or the faint tap of a spoon. Rumor said he was part of the psychological unit, trained to observe signs of mental collapse. But what no one realized, until too late, was that he wasn't just observing. 3 days after Marcus received the note, the man in the next cell stopped responding. No tapping, no movement, just silence. Then came a different sound, the heavy mechanical whine of a gurney wheel. Marcus pressed his ear to the concrete, heart racing. The guards were removing someone, but no one said who. That night, the Listener stopped at Marcus's cell. "Rough week, Hill?" The voice was calm, almost kind. "You've been quiet lately." Marcus didn't answer. He'd learned that silence was safer than speech. But then the Listener said something that froze him completely. "I know about your daughter," the guard whispered. "Lila, right? 10 years old now?" Marcus's stomach dropped. He hadn't spoken her name in years. There was no record of her in his prison file, not that kind of detail. "How do you," he began, but the guard was already gone, the sound of his boots fading down the corridor. That night, Marcus couldn't think. Every creak of metal felt like a heartbeat. Every flicker of the overhead light felt like a message. If the guards knew about his family, then someone had been talking. Or listening. He started to wonder if the tapping on the wall had ever been real at all. Sleep became impossible. Food lost its taste. Even his own thoughts felt foreign, like echoes of someone else's voice. On the 4th day, a new scrap of paper appeared under his door. This time, it had words, scribbled in pencil, almost too faint to read. "They hear everything. Don't trust the walls." Marcus pressed the paper to his chest, his breath shallow. The system wasn't just breaking men, it was turning them into test subjects. And deep in that silence, where walls had ears and time had teeth, Marcus realized the truth. He wasn't fighting loneliness anymore. He was fighting for his mind. By the 5th week, Marcus had stopped marking the days. The scratches on the wall had begun to look like a language of their own, something between madness and memory. He didn't know which he feared more, losing his mind, or finding out it was already gone. The note, "They hear everything," had become his mantra. He repeated it in his head like a prayer, a warning, a reminder. The Listener had vanished for days, maybe reassigned, maybe watching from somewhere unseen. But the silence he left behind felt heavier than presence itself. Marcus began to test the theory. He whispered to the walls, nothing important, just fragments of thoughts. Then he'd wait. Sometimes, within hours, the guards would react. The lights would flicker. A food tray would come late. The vents would hum louder. As if the prison itself was listening, responding, correcting him. He started wondering if that was the point. Pelican Bay wasn't just a prison, it was an experiment. Other inmates had vanished from the SHU, one by one. Some were transferred. Some self-harmed. But others simply disappeared. Their numbers erased from the logs, their names never spoken again. One morning, the tapping returned. Too short. One long. Marcus froze. Whoever it was, if it was even real, they were back. He pressed his hand against the cold concrete. "Who are you?" he whispered. The reply came, slow and deliberate, one short, two long. He didn't recognize the code. He didn't need to. It meant one thing: someone still knew he existed. For the first time in months, Marcus smiled. A broken, fragile smile, but real. He whispered back, "I hear you." Hours later, the listener returned. His voice slid through the door like smoke. "You've been communicating again," he said. "We told you what happens when you do that." Marcus didn't answer. He could feel the guard's breath through the slot in the steel door. "Do you ever wonder," the listener continued, "what happens when a man becomes so silent that even his thoughts start echoing back at him?" The words lingered like poison. Then came the sound of paper sliding across the floor, another note. But when Marcus picked it up, his blood ran cold. It wasn't written in pencil this time. It was typed. Official. Subject Hill, Marcus, experimental phase complete. Transfer approved, Unit 13B, Sensory Study Group. All prior communications nullified. Marcus pressed his forehead against the door. He shouted, cursed, begged, but his voice barely rose above the hum of the fluorescent light. That night, they came for him. For guards in black, silent as shadow. No words. No cuffs. Just the sound of chains tightening around his wrists. As they walked him down the corridor, Marcus realized the other cells were empty. Every single one. The men, the voices, the tapping, all gone. When the door to Unit 13B opened, he saw it wasn't a cell. It was a room of mirrors. Ceiling to floor. Each reflection a fractured version of himself, pale, hollow-eyed, trembling. In the center, a single chair faced the wall. On the wall, a speaker. Then a voice. Calm. Familiar. "Welcome back, Marcus," said the listener. "Let's see how well your mind holds up when there's nowhere left to hide." The speaker crackled. Then, softly, the sound began again. Two short knocks. One long. Over and over. Until Marcus couldn't tell if it was coming from the walls, or from inside his head. And in that moment, he understood, isolation wasn't the punishment. It was the test. If you think this story was intense, the next one will leave you speechless. Subscribe for more true crime stories that'll keep you on the edge of your seat.